Good evening and welcome again. I'm honored to be here with Lester Friedman, author of Monstrous Progeny, A History of the Frankenstein Narratives. He was former chair of Media and Society program at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. There's several areas I'm hoping we can cover today in our discussion, including Young Frankenstein's homage to popular culture and Hollywood cinema, especially the James Whale films of the 1930s, the film's debt to Mary Shelley and the kind of mixed inheritance of both, and its significance as a Frankenstein narrative. So, to begin, Mel Brooks has said that the original Frankenstein terrified him as a child. He also said he didn't want his film to just be hilarious or just frightening, but a subtle combination of both comedy and horror. I know you've written a lot about genre, but does Young Frankenstein achieve this? I mean, what could possibly be frightening about it?
I agree. Actually,
Yeah.
actually, we talked about that. I was thinking about that when we were going through the film again, and I had seen it recently. And I guess what I don't know is how people must have reacted the first time they saw it. But did anybody find anything frightening in this movie? No. So we'll go to the next question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Although I think it's interesting generically, because so he's retelling the tale that frightened him as a child, but of course he makes major changes to the.
Well, he actually tells the story that he thought and he calls it Frankenstein. Of course, he confuses, like so many people confuse the name with the creature. He felt that Frankenstein was going to come up the fire escape and into his apartment in Brooklyn. And his mother gave him this elaborate answer. He would have to get on a boat, he would have to take a train, he would have to figure out where they live, and finally just put him at ease. So I think by the time he came to this, he wasn't particularly frightened
Although it
anymore.
made a major impression.
Right.
So both Gene Wilder and Mel Brooks wanted to remain faithful to the tempo and look of James Whale's 1931 Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein from 35. As I noted earlier, they even rented the original Frankenstein laboratory with its high voltage special effects and elevator platform to intercept lightning bolts. Can you say more about the film's style and how it's a homage to classical?
Well, it's more than just renting it. Actually, Kenneth Strickfaden, whose lab it was, came on the set and showed them how to work everything. He must have been, 110? But it was the original 1931, then they used it in 35, and Mel Brooks found it again. There's several things that one could talk about that draw back to it. First of all, of course, black and white.
Right.
And there was a fight about it because the studio did not want them to make a black and white film.
And could you explain to the audience why they wouldn't want a black and white film in 1974?
No one would go. I mean, they were just afraid of all of that. I mean, pre-Schindler. So they really didn't want it. But Brooks convinced them to do it. And he did a number of things that we would know from that era, such as wipes. So you can see the film wipes left and wipes right, wipes up, wipes down. And then there's the iris in, with the circle comes in and then the circle comes out. But mostly what's interesting is he incorporated Whale's use of German expressionism. Now, what that means is that he's using a lot of shadows. And you can see this in the film, right? All the shots of the shadows, the shots that are a little oblique and sort of upset your normal sort of expectation for the composition of a frame. So you're a little disconcerted with it. And more importantly, of course, as you know, German expressionism has most of the frame is dark with pools of light. So you never know what's going to jump out from the shadows. You never know what's going to jump out from what's beyond the frame. And so they incorporate that. Now, along with that, of course, they do all the modern stuff. They break the fourth wall. They look at us. They mug. Right. And they, of course, overact. This time around, forgive me, and I don't mean this politically at all, though I think we could talk about this film politically.
We
Is
will.
that not a Trumpian hairdo that he has? I mean, I watched it this time around. I thought that's pretty close, right? You know, the comb over from the side, from the waist.
For me, it was the torch-bearing crowd that reminded me of Charlottesville. But let's wait.
Yes, yes,
So
of course.
beyond its references to Wales film, Young Frankenstein also references other forms of popular culture. Now, I have this quote, so I want to read it to you. Brooks initially thought, for instance, that the number putting on the Ritz was too outside of the film's homage to Hollywood classics. In the end, the sequence was included, of course, and Brooks has said this, and I quote, "We left James Whale, and we went to where we wanted to be. That's what audiences were paying for. On Young Frankenstein, we asked ourselves, would the monster enjoy a nice Irving Berlin tune? Yes, he would, and so would the audience," end quote. And so it was included. So can you say more about this and other kinds of popular cultural references in the film?
Yeah, the putting on the Ritz scene, you're absolutely right. And Brooks has talked about that Wilder insisted on it. And the deal was they would include it in the first audience preview. And if the audience didn't laugh, it would go out. Brooks thought it would take them too far out, that it would become too much of a contemporary reference. And Wilder said no. And the first time they showed it, of course, people laughed hysterically, and he just said it was in. The other scene Brooks wanted to take out, and I always get the quote wrong, so you'll get me, is it walk, I always want to say walk like me, walk like this, right?
Walk like this.
Walk like this.
Walk this way.
Walk this way. Walk this way.
And we know whether that...
Yeah, he wanted to take that out. He thought it was a cheap joke. And, you know, and it's become very famous. Everyone but me quotes it correctly. You know, I never get it right. But he thought he would take that out. There's the "Pardon Me, Boy."
Yes.
You know, it's just that Glenn Miller business. There's all of that. But mostly it's the idea of how they interplay with the audience and overplay with each other. But how many of you have read the novel? How many of you have read the novel? Well, he's not far off from what Victor Frankenstein is like. I mean, Victor Frankenstein is hysterical, fainting, doing all these things, hyperbolically acting in most of the novel. And I think Wilder picks up on that and really characterizes that forward. The other thing, of course, is the double entendres and the sexual references, which now seem quite tame. You know, nice knockers and that kind of stuff seems pretty tame in these days.
Still funny. And
Yeah, it is funny.
Well, let's move a little bit. Let's move closer to Mary Shelley. So here we have a film that reverses the traditional view of Frankenstein.
It does.
The scientist and doctor driven by unchecked male ambition. Played by Gene Wilder, Dr. Frankenstein is now a more supportive and finally a benevolent father figure who risks his life to save his creature. So is Mel Brooks's creature closer to Mary Shelley's creature than to Wales?
Well, I mean, this is a complicated question.
I know.
This is a complicated question.
I never said it was going to be.
Okay. Because Wales's creature is, of course, different than Mary Shelley's creature. And Wales's creature doesn't speak. You know, as we know, famously doesn't speak. Of course, Mary Shelley's creature is very articulate.
Yes.
I will go back just to say something about Mary Shelley and Victor Frankenstein. Unlike how most people read the novel, I don't think that Mary Shelley ever condemns Victor's ambition. And that is a minority reading of it. I think what happens in that novel and what she condemns is two things. How he goes about it in isolation without help from anybody. There's no Igor in the novel. And more importantly, how Victor Frankenstein does not take responsibility, parental responsibility. I mean, when I teach Frankenstein, then I'll get into Whale in a second. When I teach Frankenstein, I teach the creature in 2 or 3 different ways. One, a person with a disability. And that plugs into a very modern consciousness. 2, an abused child. And 3, a marginalized creature. And as you know, that creature has been used as a format for dealing with all sorts of marginalized, subaltern, whether it's Jews, gays, blacks, women, people in a caravan,
Right.
all of that, the creature fits into a perfectly good symbol. So that's Mary Shelley. Now we get to James Whale. And the creature is very different in James Whale than Mary Shelley. In Mary Shelley, the creature comes out perfectly tabula rasa. Not bad, not good. Nature versus nurture. Society makes the creature bad. The creature responds to cruelty by becoming cruel. In James Whale, abnormal brain, abnormal, nature is much more evident because he's got a criminal brain. So that's what Brooks plays with here. But you put your finger on, I think, the most important scene, and that's the scene where he goes in and he shows parental love for that creature. Because I think Young Frankenstein is one of the best retellings of the Shelley narrative. And Mel Brooks understands what's missing here. And he becomes I'm going to teach you to walk. I'm going to teach you to do this. This is a mother's only child, and in that scene, he really ties the creature to him in profoundly emotional ways that Victor Frankenstein always fails to do in Mary Shelley and, in James Whale, too.
Yeah. Well, I want to return to some of those issues in just a minute, but I wanted to just follow up a bit and say, about other changes in this. I mean, how does the introduction of Inga as Dr. Frankenstein's love interest change the traditional telling of the story? I mean, in Bride for Frankenstein, the most compelling couple in the film is the creature and the blind hermit. I mean, that's the couple, that's where you sense a real kind of connection and friendship. Here, with both Elizabeth and Inga, other partnerings, heterosexual partnerings, become possible. Could you say more about that, the addition of the new character?
Yeah. Let me go back again to contextualize with the novel and then come forward. The novel has clearly, in my mind, a homoerotic subtext. What does Victor have? What does Victor reject? Victor rejects heterosexual love, friendship with Clairville, and a parental context with his family. What does the creature want? Heteronormative love with the bride, a friend, and a parent.
Right.
So, and the novel is set up so that over here is the conventional world, and over here is what you do at night by yourself that you're ashamed of. And so, and if you go back into the novel, look at the language in which Walton describes Frankenstein, and which Frankenstein describes Clairville, it's a very heightened language, but a very homoerotic kind of language. Okay, so now we get to Mel Brooks. And Mel Brooks introduces first of all, two kinds of women.
Yep.
And conveniently brunette and blonde, and conveniently cold. Mm-hmm. And if you stop again and think about the novel, there's only one time, and it's in a dream, where Victor shows any passion for Elizabeth.
Right.
And as he kisses her, do you remember what happens? She turns into his mother. I mean, really, go to the therapist. I mean, that's a really complicated piece of fiction. In Mel Brooks, and by the way, in Whale also, same thing. Mm-hmm. The passions between the creature and Elizabeth, really, more than anything else. And in The Bride as well. There's never a whole lot of passion between Victor and Elizabeth in any of the early Frankenstein films or in Mary Shelley. Here, you get Elizabeth as the opening scene when she's saying goodbye, and she won't even let him kiss. If you notice, it's a very subtle moment. Do you see when he blows her a kiss and she ducks? You know, she doesn't even want to be messed up by the kiss in the air. That's not really a kiss. So he sides with the very sexual blonde. Now, when I actually wrote about this film in a whole different academic life when I was writing about Jews in film. And it played into a very kind of blonde, I want to say this, it was a long time ago, and it was much less politically correct than it wasn't particularly then. But that kind of blonde sexuality, the search for the perfect Gentile woman, the sexual woman as opposed to the dark-haired Jewish woman. And you can see Brooks plays with that here. I mean, what does Brooks do at the end? Are we going to talk about the end at all? I can
Go on.
go on. Okay. So what's traded here? Brains for sexual anatomy, right? Brains for sexuality. I mean, it's a kind of nerd's dream.
Yeah.
You know, to give up part of that, but to become at the end. Oh, you know what I forgot to say? I want to say this because you talked about homage to whales. One of the things Brooks is very proud of is that he, except for once, and I'll tell you what that is in a second, he used only the camera materials that Whale used. There's only one zoom in that whole film. The rest of the time, he kind of trundles in with the camera. The only zoom is the last shot, which is a little shaky, you know, a little blurry even, that last shot when you come into Victor. But he was very conscious of trying to film it as Whale would have filmed it at that point.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it is.
So I want to just go back a little bit. There's so many wonderful performances in this film. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about what characters Mel Brooks reimagines here in Gene Wilder, you know, such as Una O'Connor's Minnie, the hysterical castle servant of
From The
Bride.
Bride.
Yeah, played here by Cloris Leachman. So which are new to this retelling? We've just said Inga as a kind of new character. And which ones are remade from earlier films?
Yeah, well, again, if you know from the novel, there's no assistant. There's no Igor, whatever. And critics have talked about that character pretty unsympathetically as sort of the midpoint between human and non-human, a kind of Caliban, figure. Actually, it doesn't appear. He doesn't appear till the stage. The stage. People don't understand that Mary Shelley, 1818, 1831, James Whale, 1931. So there's, you know, a long period of time. Well, what's going on in there? Frankenstein did not disappear. There were plays after plays after plays. And many of the characters that end up in Whale, by the way, says he never read the novel. I don't know if that's true. We don't know. But by the time Whale gets a hold of Balderston's and Webling's script, they've got the assistant in it, they've changed his name, they do all sorts of other things. Okay, so the housemaid character is not in the novel, but as you say, she shows up in The Bride. The assistant shows up along the way, and of course the creature. Now, how is the creature changed? One of the interesting things is about the evolution of the creature, because if we look at today, I brought along, by the way, just for fun, 2 books published in 2018, Frankenstein stories. I mean, it never goes away. This is a French book. It's called Desirable Body, where they transplant a head onto a dead, and this is absolutely fascinating if you don't know it. Frankenstein in Baghdad, what happens is a junk man, literally in Baghdad, goes around and collects parts of bodies that were killed and dismembered by American bombs, and puts together a Frankenstein creature. So the narrative goes on and on and on. What I was going to say is that Victor Frankenstein has stayed the same. He's the mad scientist. But the creature has evolved dramatically. The creature is now a positive figure. The creature is the savior of mankind, particularly, Patrice, in graphic novels and comic books. Frankenstein, Agent of Shade, Doc Frankenstein. And that's not about Frankenstein. It's about the creature. And so the creature has evolved tremendously.
Well,
I didn't answer your question. Well, go ahead.
don't worry, there's more questions.
There's more
and
questions.
More answers
Okay.
at all times.
I wandered.
That's okay. No, it has been interesting. Not too long ago, we had a faculty member here organize a day-long symposium on Frankenstein, the novel, and its various adaptations and iterations. And, you know, it was really fascinating in the course of the day to see those who were really identified with the scientists and talking about questions of bioethics and responsibility, and the others, you know, who were talking more about the monster as this kind of other, and as you said in your earlier comments, as a kind of stand-in for all kinds of groups that are excluded and oppressed for how they look, for how they behave, how they're different, how they become monstrous. Women, gay people, yeah, and we're going to go on.
And it started early.
And as a kind of a very colonial project. Too.
Very. And depending on who controlled what, it's, for example, in the British press, they pictured the French Revolution as a creature,
right,
as Frankenstein's creature. And I've seen two recently, just recently, Trumpian uses. The first one with Trump as Dr. Frankenstein and creating Charlottesville, and the second as the Republican Party and Trump as the creature. So
if only he was so calm.
Yes, I know, it goes both ways, but the image is so pervasive in our culture. And the very prefix, the very part of the word becomes Frankenfood, you know, Franken this, Franken that. I mean, it's almost impossible to not read about Frankenstein over the course of a week in some way, and not just in the 200th anniversary.
Right, and not just in the United States.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit more about the female characters in the film. Although what struck me initially, I thought women in Frankenstein narratives fit into very few roles. The loving, sacrificial mother, the innocent, sensitive child, the girl with the flower, the concerned, confused, and abandoned lover. But here they're central to the comedy and to the film's depiction of creativity and its links to sexuality. Could you say more about that?
Sure. I want to say very quickly also that there are two variations in the narrative. One, when Frankenstein creates a female creature, classically imagined in, ready? Frankenhooker.
Yes.
Yes, a real film.
Carol Flynn was just here and was talking about Frankenhooker and that we should have shown it.
Yes, it actually is interesting.
Will you tell him a little bit about what Frankenhooker's about?
Well, he puts together, it would be fairly clear, right, what he does. But what's interesting and makes Frankenhooker archetypal in many ways is that almost inevitably, Dr. Frankenstein falls in love with his creation. I mean, really replays the Pygmalion myth at that point. Really falls in love with the creature with disastrous results. I don't know if any of you have watched Penny Dreadful, which has a Frankenstein creature in it as well. Same thing happened. So on the one hand, that's the one variation where he creates a female creature. The second variation is where Frankenstein is a female and creates a male companion of one form or another, and much the same things happen there. In the novel, the female creatures, even though it's the great feminist novel in many, many ways, the female characters mostly die and are reasonably insipid and secondary characters. Where it becomes, I think, a feminist piece is in terms of childbirth and taking that away from women and making that possible. Now, I think we have to admit that that now is a reality. I mean, that Frankensteinian prophecy of being able to have childbirth without intercourse happens on a daily basis in laboratories and places all over. So that's a very real reproductive moment. Into Mel Brooks, finally. Yes, the characters are central, and they are central in the sense that they are part of the creative process and part of the humorous process, and the sexuality, particularly of roll in the hay, particularly of Inga, really frees Frankenstein up, and she becomes a central part of that process, where that doesn't exist. I'm trying to rack my brain to think of any other film where that exists, and I can't think of any. So I think that's very crucial. I don't know what the heck to do with Elizabeth in this, to some extent, other than Brooks needs her to juxtapose as a dramatic character and put on, of course, the Bride of Frankenstein.
Then it's, in kind of a relation to James Whale, I mean, where the St. Elsa Lanchester plays both Mary and the bride. I mean,
Mary
here
and
it's
the bride.
so here Elizabeth is the bride meant for the creature.
She is. She really is. Yeah, I think The Bride of Frankenstein is the best of those early films and the cleverest, and part of the difference is that Whale had money.
Yeah.
And they wanted him to do it because the first one had been so successful. This film, by the way, was made for about $2.3 million, and the last time I checked box office, it had made over $100 million. So we hope Mel Brooks had a piece, and everyone else in it also. It's probably the most successful, certainly one of the most successful comedies ever made. My students, after a while, start doing the lines.
I've been doing the lines for
Yeah,
decades.
you've been doing the lines for decades.
So I wanted to, since you have written a book on, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, multiple versions across film and television.
Right.
So I wanted to ask, it's really, this is something that stumped me, and I didn't find the answer immediately in your book, but I was trying to think of, when we were designing the series, we were trying to think of, how we wanted to frame it, and we didn't want it to be a discussion of bioethics, and we really wanted to be true to Mary Shelley's vision, and that's why we began with the Mary Shelley biopic, Haifa al-Mansour's biopic, which has mixed reviews, but at least it tries to give us a sense of the story behind the story. But what struck me is there's so many great Frankenstein adaptations in the early 70s. We've shown, so this film, Spirit of the Beehive, Rocky Horror. So I was wondering, so is this, if Frankenstein is in a sense a post-revolutionary tale, both in Mary Shelley and after that, is this a post-60s film when there's a sense that certain ideals were lost and there had to be a kind of rethinking or a new kind of refiguring here that takes the place of, parental love, acceptance, and so on. So I wonder, I don't know what you think about why there's so many Frankenstein adaptations in the 70s. And so many fine ones. Flesh for Frankenstein. And secondly, then I thought, well, maybe that's the wrong question. Although I want you to answer it if you can. But then I thought, is this really reflecting U.S. culture at a particular place and time, or is it also really much more about Jewish comedy and reflecting on Jewish history, where the mob with torches and not the monster is what should be feared?
Well, I mean, that's a really, really good question. And, we didn't consider that. And I hadn't really thought about, of all people, not to think about the 70s also, I hadn't really thought about it. But as you were saying that, I was thinking, well, I think the reason is, if I were to give a snap answer to that, is that sympathy shifted to the outsider in the 70s. And also, I mean, there's a couple of things, and we'll get to the Jewish stuff in a moment, but there's a couple of things. First of all, it is social upheaval.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, gay liberation, women's lib, Black Power movement, Vietnam, I mean, the protest movement, I mean, things are just swirling around that are still with us and are crucial, important, and have shifted and changed society. But most of all, I think, certainly in the youth generation, the sympathy went from the status quo, let's say, which it was with in the 50s and the early 60s, to the marginalized outsider. In fact, youth felt like the marginalized outsider. So there was sympathy for the devil,
Right.
you know, to use the Stones tune. There was sympathy for the creature who was both misunderstood and threatened by and radicalized by society. So, I mean, that would be my sort of snap answer to that question.
Yeah, no, it's good. Well, just to kind of take this a little bit further, another thing that really perplexed me, not anymore now, I think
I'm glad I'm here to help your perplexing. Yes, go ahead.
Well, Mel Brooks said that his film, and he said, I'm quoting, deals with the ignorant versus the intelligent, the mob versus the intelligent people. He goes on to say, the monster is symbolic of his mind, and the mob hates his mind. They hate his imagination. Okay, so given that this is what he says, why does Brooks retain the motif of the abnormal or corrupt brain, which isn't present in the novel, nor in Bride, although it was introduced in the original Frankenstein, to account for the creature's monstrousness? I mean, I think that it's really interesting that, you know, it's of course hilarious with, you know, Hans Delbruck and Abby Normal and all of that. But while the film introduces it, it also kind of complicates that as well. So I wanted you to say a little bit.
Well, it actually undercuts it by the end. I mean, I think I mean, I think sometimes there's a easy answer, and the easy answer is he wanted to echo Wales. I mean, that's the easy answer. But I think the more complicated answer is he shows that biology is not destiny, right? That they can change it. I wanted to answer a question that you have not asked.
Please.
Okay, and I want to put to rest a myth that I only found about when I was doing research again. The myth is that Blücher in German means glue, and that's why the horses whinny. It's not true. Doesn't mean it. It doesn't mean it. And Gene Wilder said he found the name somewhere and he thought it was very German, and then Brooks added the, you know, the origin of Young Frankenstein is interesting, and I can give it in a quick 30 seconds. Mel Brooks was wooing Anne Bancroft, and she was in Mother Courage. It's always interesting to think of Mel Brooks as being married to Mrs. Robinson, but perhaps another story. Was wooing Anne Bancroft, and Gene Wilder was in the play, so he got to know Wilder. And then he started to make Blazing Saddles, and Gig Young was the Waco Kid. And he got sick and he needed someone, and he called Wilder, and Wilder stepped into the role. And in the middle of making Blazing Saddles, Wilder tells the story, and Brooks tells the exact same story, was sitting in the commissary, and for no reason he had a yellow pad, and he put on it Young Frankenstein. And Brooks came over and he said, "What does that mean?" And Wilder said, "I have no idea." And from there, but will you write it with me? And indeed, Wilder wrote the early first drafts. And then Brooks was editing Blazing Saddles, which became a massive hit, of course. And then Brooks came in, and they ended up writing this particular script. So it's interesting to see that period of creativity, and just from an idea that strikes him, Wilder said maybe he was thinking of young Edison. I don't know where that comes from, but that's how they get into that process. And I don't think Wilder's ever been better. And Brooks is blessed with a great cast here. My goodness, I mean, just everybody. The other piece, other two pieces of trivia found. One I told you at dinner that I'm on a roll now. That Peter Boyle's best man at his wedding was John Lennon. It's a strange thing. And the other thing was that Cloris Leachman was in the top 5 candidates in the Miss America contest. Thank you.
Not as Frau Blucher.
No, not as... And she added the wart, by the way. So he had this incredible creative cast, all playing at the height of their powers, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the abnormal brain because I know you have a lot to say about it. But one of the things that struck me, to answer my own question about why this kind of motif returns in this film, but you're absolutely right. I mean, there is this way that the abnormal brain, well, first, Gene Wilder says, it's a criminal brain. But then, he knows that, unlike Whale's film, where the abnormal brain suggests eugenics, like people are born, there are good brains and there are bad brains. There are brains that belong to people of color, for instance, that are bad and not as superior to other brains of a saint and a scientist. And so here, that comes back with the, because Igor makes this stupid mistake and gets afraid of his own reflection. So, and yet what happens is that that's completely rejected. The idea that, the police chief who says, you're a Frankenstein, it's in your blood, that you're all evil, and, that can't be any different. And of course, it is very anti-Semitic, kind of very racist. I mean, all of these motifs were there in Whale. And here they're remembered, but thought of differently, so that when he has the experiments, he can change the cerebral cortex, and he becomes very erudite. Again, very different than Shelley's, where he's listening to
the DeLacy's in the woods, and learning, reading Rousseau in Paradise Lost. And,
right. So I wondered if you had more to say about that.
No. No, I do. No, I think you're right. And I think the other thing, I think also this is where the gay subtext comes in to both of the Whale's films. I mean, you have to understand that Whale's, James Whale's living as a gay man in the 1930s, and even in liberal Hollywood, this is a very undone thing at this period of time. And Colin Clive is gay, and of course, when we get to Bride of Frankenstein, so is Theringer, who plays Pretorius. So these are guys who know what it's like to be discriminated against. These are guys who know what it is like to live as outsiders and marginalized in a society, who are seen as sick, as something's wrong with your brain, something's wrong with who you are. And so I think they take that on, and you're right, it disappears in Bride, though you have the homunculi and you have other kinds of things going on in Bride. So I think that their sympathy is with the creature there, and I think that they're going to reject the notion that biology is destiny in their films. And certainly, as I say, when Brooks picks it up as a very Jewish theme, I think in some ways, he does the same thing.
But isn't it there in James Whale? I mean, the images of the, torch-carrying townspeople and lynchings, and so that this is between 1931 and 1935. I mean, a little more than a year ago, we were talking here on this stage about Fritz Lang's Fury from 1934. They had to cast Spencer Tracy in the lead role, but it was all about apparently Fritz Lang's first year in the United States, traveling across America, just being so shocked by the pervasiveness of the lynching of black people, and wanted to make a film that somehow evoked this. So those images of mobs and torches less than the, the closeted or not so closeted gay lifestyle, but really specifically, a kind of anti-Semitic mob and racist mob violence.
It is. Well, here you actually have someone swinging from a rope.
Right.
I mean, you actually have the lynching image
Right.
in quite overt way. And I think those mobs are lynch mobs,
Yeah.
and those mobs are pogroms, and those mobs are negative images even played for fun here. I mean, they are kind of played for fun here. But that's there. I think that anti-Semitic stuff is there.
I hope you really enjoyed the movie, and I hope we didn't take away some of the jokes, but you can, act casual and say nothing. There's plenty of lines for you to draw on in your everyday life. And join me in thanking Lester Friedman for coming here and to talk to us about the film.
Thank you.